Don asked a really good question. For me, I haven't found a whole lot except looking in older articles. I think John Clark has a publishable one. If you search the government databases, I can put a link in that you can see. I'm trying to think. One of the ones I really like is R.J. Kelly published it. It's called Peroxidizable Organic Chemicals Handbook of Chemical and Safety. And that is the only one that I found that really goes into some of the molecular mechanisms by which these processes take place. It doesn't go super in depth. Maybe one of the other speakers knows, or maybe one of you out there knows of some better citations.
Yeah, this is great. We're going to jump into the Q&A a little later in the webinar. So Don asked a question about the foundational research that provides the basis for class A, B, and C peroxide formers. So we'll be able to get back to that and dive in a little bit deeper into that question towards the end of the webinar. But it is 3:05 p.m. Eastern time, so our webinar is going to get started. A big thank you to everybody for joining us today. This is the BioRAFT EHS Community Connection webinar series, and today you are on for peroxide formers tracking and disposal. These webinars are a series of webinars helping to connect professionals across the health and safety community from all roles, industries, backgrounds, trying to bring us together, help us discover new best practices in our new COVID world, and generally share information and feel a little more connected, even as we are opening back up to normal times. I'm your host, Matt Siegel. I work here at BioRAFT. We had a request recently from a couple attendees, asking about what is BioRAFT. I realize I don't really do too much in the way of introductions here. We try to keep these focused on the topics and not on you, but brief overview, BioRAFT is a laboratory safety software. We provide an enterprise level software that uses different solutions to just address your different safety needs, from inspections, training. You'll hear about ChemTracker possibly today. All those different things. But again, this isn't about us. This is about you, our audience. So these are our panelists. I'd like to introduce Jeffrey, Tammy, and Cory. Have you guys go through, give a brief introduction about yourselves, and then we can get into our prepared questions. As we go through here and in today, feel free to take a quick stab at our prompt of the week. It's really nice to hear about how many years everybody has of managing experience, managing safety. We've been keeping track over here. It's really fun to watch this number grow, and I'll be totaling it up and sharing it later. And also down in the Zoom webinar control panel, you'll see a Q&A button. That will open up a window where you'll be able to see other people's questions. Reference that one that Tammy mentioned earlier from Dawn, asking about different classes of peroxide formers, and you'll be able to thumbs up the questions you're interested in, as well as respond to each other's questions. We try not to bottleneck information here and instead enable all of you to respond to each other's questions, provide your own background information, clarification. It just makes it really nice to have that flow of information be a little bit, more dispersed. So Jeff, would you like to start us off here and tell us a little about yourself?
No, ladies first.
Well, I have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. I spent most of my life doing research, been top research, a lot of chemicals, chemistry, doing chemical synthesis of drugs, photoactivatable compounds, etc. And about 12 years ago, I moved over into the safety role that I'm currently in as safety coordinator in chemical engineering. I serve as an in-house consultant for a lot of other people across campus periodically, and I have run into my share of peroxide formers in this job and previously.
Cory, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Cory Martin. I'm the founder and CEO of Spotlight Safety. We provide safety consulting services for laboratories, primarily biotech and life sciences groups in the New England area. And I got my start in safety. I'm a scientist by background, but got my start in safety as the research safety officer at Dartmouth College. So have an academic background, did a lot of peroxide former checks in that context. So I was rooting around in a lot of flammable cabinets, as I'm sure if you're in academia, you can understand. And yeah, I've helped a lot of groups set up peroxide former tracking programs, and yeah, I consider it one of my passion areas for groups that need help on that. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
And Jeff.
So I'm Jeff Harris. I am the chemical safety manager at Carnegie Mellon University. I actually came here almost 20 years ago from the University of Arkansas, where I was in Tammy's role on that campus, and very exciting role at that. And I come to know peroxides and peroxide formers by being in the hazardous waste business, managing waste out of the labs and getting those unique things that just look scary, and then you go and confirm that they are indeed potential, and what do you do after that? So a lot of experience on the back end of it, but in my current role, trying to get on the front end of how these materials land on our campus, and how they're stored and how we track them. And so BioRAFT is a great tool for that. I always tell people, Matt, BioRAFT is an acronym for your biography, risk assured focused training. I know that's not exactly correct, but that's what I tell people.
I appreciate it. But we can go ahead and jump into our prepared questions for this webinar. So we'll ask our panelists a few different questions that we've given them ahead of time so they have a chance to get their answers ready, and then move on to a live Q&A at about 2:45 Eastern time. So first question here, Cory, I was wondering if you could tell me about what misperceptions you've seen related to peroxide formers that you'd like to clarify.
Yeah, so I think there's a disconnect between how scientists view peroxide formers and how safety professionals view peroxide formers. I think if you know enough about peroxide formers to understand the dangers, you're terrified. I think if you've been working with them for 30 years and nothing's ever blown up, you think it's all hooey. And so I think there is a communication effort that needs to happen between safety teams and scientists, and to get everyone on the same page. Because if you're a newer safety professional and you walk into the lab and you say, oh my gosh, you're working with safety peroxide formers, let's dispose of those immediately, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. And but there are very real implications around mismanagement of peroxide formers, and they can be dangerous if you're not using them properly. And those need to be articulated in a way that they can understand it. Usually that's related to research integrity or cost savings, from my experience, as a first step to bridge the gap between, they don't understand them as safety concerns yet. So you can kind of approach them in other ways. The other major misperception that I've seen is inhibited peroxide formers can't hurt me. And there is a misunderstanding in a lot of circles about what the inhibition process is. And once you're out of that inhibitor, peroxides can go. So it's only a safety mechanism for a short period of time. And if it continues to be mismanaged, it can actually accelerate the process, and you can get kind of a runaway train pretty quickly because the storage conditions have kind of made them that way. But so I think those are the two biggest ones, just perception, and then, what does inhibited actually mean?
Just a quick note here, Tammy, Jeff, Cory, as you hear your fellow panelists answer questions, if anything comes to mind, feel free to chime in afterwards with your own thoughts. I think that's sometimes where we discover some of the most interesting conversations on these webinars. And Tammy, the next question I have is for you. What role do you believe education plays in a peroxide former management program?
Well, I think you need two things. You need to squeeze the water out of the stone, so to say. You need the top level with the inventory management, but you also need the users to be aware. For instance, when I first started doing chemical synthesis, and I started off actually working in a stockroom as an undergraduate, I was doing a chemical synthesis and it blew my column 2 times, and it broke and cracked. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll just start with new compounds. Well, I ordered new solvents, and lo and behold, it fixed it. But 15 years later, I realized, oh, I was working with peroxide formers. That's why the fresh new compound works so well. So I think users, as Cory said, they tend to either not believe it's real, or they tend to be scared. But I think just integrating into your onboarding system, I have an educational component. 15 minutes is all it takes to really talk to people about what peroxide formers are, and they're going to feel safer using them, actually do better chemistry by using them correctly, and get better product conversion is what we've seen. and even in my institution here, and cost everybody less money at the end by not letting those compounds age on the shelf.
All right, and next question, Jeff, is for you. One of the reasons that tracking peroxide forming chemicals is so challenging is because of the additional workload that it represents. So how do you manage that added layer of difficulty in your own peroxide former management program?
We do put this off onto the labs. The inventory owner is responsible for knowing what they have, where they have it, how much there is, and how old it is. But luckily for us then, ChemTracker allows for us to go in and specifically look for peroxide formers. Even if we didn't do that, we could go in and you could find in somebody's inventory the peroxide former or any chemical for that matter, and basically look at when was it entered. That is a feature in ChemTracker that once you enter a material, it's automatically dated. And then you can go back and see when it was edited last. And so this is kind of one of the primary ways that we keep an eye on the users. It is every bit their responsibility to date the container when it arrives, right? So that's a best practice that we encourage people to do, especially with peroxide formers. If they don't have it on there, date opened is a best practice for most chemists. So you understand this is the bottle and you understand when it was actually opened. But for the most part, we are looking in the system that we have. We're looking in BioRAFT ChemTracker, and we're pulling out those materials that we feel haven't been looked at, touched, or addressed in a long period of time, and then trying to highlight them in the inspection process, as opposed to maybe sending a blanket message out to everybody who has peroxide formers that look to be years old. We'll try to catch it in the inspection process. Where we know going in, they have the peroxide formers, show us the peroxide formers, and then that's where we usually denote in a finding what they need to get rid of. That's one of the top ways we track these materials, aside from how and when they're procured. We do know when they're coming onto campus now because we have linked up with our procurement services, and we have that review. So when we see peroxide formers, we might make a note to the buyer. Hey, please remind the inventory owner of this. And then of course in BioRAFT, if we can get them to do this, which is our main push going forward, you could put in the expiration date in BioRAFT. There is a field for that in the ChemTracker inventory system. And if we get people to do that, I think that would make a huge impact for being able to get rid of these things before they expire.
And Cory, next question is coming your way. I was wondering if you could share any particularly effective resources or messaging to educate scientists at the organizations that you support about peroxide formers. Anything that our audience might be able to search up, go to, or takeaways that would be useful.
Yeah, so I think step one is to have them understand what peroxide formers actually are. I think there are a lot of entry-level chemists that haven't really considered that some of the materials that they are using are classified as peroxide formers. If people are looking for, if their chemicals are peroxide formers or not, the SDS in section 2, the last category of hazards not otherwise classified, that is, it will say may form explosive peroxides there. But really, in terms of getting those communication channels open, I think the biggest thing is to help them understand, which chemicals in their inventory are at risk. There are, for those who are maybe newer to peroxide formers, there are different categories of risk. There are certain ones that are definitely more likely to become dangerous quickly than others. I think in most academic and industry research settings, the vast majority of them are going to be class B, kind of dangerous, but takes a little bit longer than some of the kind of instantly, bad type polymerizers, or, within a few days kind of polymerizers. But it really depends. And if you're not familiar with peroxide formers, they do take some time, but if they're stored improperly, a hairline crack in the cap, something that's not sure sealed, something that doesn't have an opaque container. These are all considerations that you definitely need to get in place toward more standardized storage. In terms of actual resources, I think, in the beginning, Tammy gave some for the historical research, but, the general peroxide former lists that are actually categorized are pretty easily searchable online these days. And, JChem Ed is a really good article on kind of going through exactly which ones fall into which categories and the general timeframes that we're talking about. So when we say expiration, that's typically going to be 12 months from opening or 6 months from, or 12 months from order or 6 months from opening for most of those class Bs that I mentioned. But if they're in one of the other categories, then there could be shorter timeframes that you want to look at. So all of those are, so SDS first, and then these other resources that are available.
Cory, I'd like to add to the SDS in the list. We can Google it and find lists. I found that University of Minnesota has some really good information on peroxide formers. They have a great peroxide former list that is downloadable. Same thing for Johns Hopkins. There's lots of universities that have policies. We have a general SOP for peroxide formers that aid with this. But the SDS stuff can be difficult because I do teach users how to realize whether something's a peroxide former. The best way is to, is it on the peroxide former list? Are you purchasing a chemical that has an inhibitor or a stabilizer in it? I mean, ask the question, why does it need to be inhibited? Why does it need to be stabilized? Maybe I need to look at this chemical a little bit more. And then, we have chemical structure things to look at, carbon content, 10 carbons or less with reactive side groups. But the safety data sheets actually can be really difficult. So I would check sections 2, 7, and 10, because I have found sometimes that it just says light sensitive, maybe in section 10 or under storage, or can degrade in light and form unstable peroxides that may explode. And it's not necessarily in that other hazards category within section 2.
Before we move on here to our next question, I just wanted to make a quick thank you to everybody who's already found the Q&A and is asking questions, and also to all the people who are answering them. Already a few minutes in, we've got a bunch of questions that would take a lot of conversation here. And I invite everybody to scroll through, and if you see something you know the answer to or you'd like clarification on, feel free to jump in and add your voice. I think that's when the webinars really become the most valuable. I've also been seeing a few different questions asking about how do we know what chemicals are peroxide formers? What are the lists we go to? So Jeff, what resources do you turn to in order to ID chemicals that have the potential for forming peroxides?
I don't know if I'm old school, but I'm a Merck Index kind of a guy, right? I mean, I am often surprised by chemicals that I thought I knew, and some of the hazards that are associated with them, especially as it's identified in the Merck Index. But I think Tammy alluded to a lot of really good ones. If there's anybody from the University of Minnesota, they have a really good, I don't know if it's a guideline or a fact sheet, but really good content on their website. And I think we did mention the peroxide forming chemicals guidance document, and then there's the NRC prudent practices on organic peroxides and peroxidizable materials. Those are really good resources. I think we all realize that the safety data sheets can be hit and miss, and so that is often not as reliable unless you're going to one of the reputable manufacturers that seem to really work hard at making those a complete document. But that would be one of my top go-tos, is the Merck Index, as well as just basically getting to the safety data sheet and seeing what you have.
One of the things that I will add is if you are looking at, say, university type websites for this, I do agree that they're great resources. Some of them use classification systems that don't align with some of the other resources. So they might have different categories than other resources that might not correlate. So if you're trying to use a university system for, say timeline development, and you say, oh, this is listed as a class C here, well, just make sure that they're using the same class C as another resource so that you're not mixing and matching there.
And Tammy, did you have anything you wanted to add there about the resources you tend to turn to ID chemicals that could form peroxides?
I think I spoke to most of them, but I also look at what's happening in the laboratories. So obviously, organic synthesis labs are going to have a lot of these type of chemicals and solvents. Membrane labs, especially with membrane modification, are going to have these vinyl monomers, which actually have to be handled a little bit differently. Their inhibitors actually require the presence of oxygen for the most part. So it kind of is the exception to the rule type things, but also I'm finding them increasingly in some of the nanomaterials synthesis as well. So those are the kind of the areas that I just intuitively look for are going to be my hot spots within my research community locally.
Yeah, I agree with that point. I think it's pretty easy if you understand the chemistry that's going on in the space to understand if you have a complete chemical inventory in front of you. I think a lot of times if you understand the synthesis that's going on in the lab, you can start to ask questions about, this seems like something that would require tetrahydrofuran or 1,4-dioxane or some of the more, or ethers, some of the more common ones that I'm not saying that they missed it intentionally, but there are certainly ways to obscure some of those more hazardous materials from chemical inventories that you're submitting for safety review.
All right, well, moving on and changing pace a little bit here, because this is tracking and disposal. There is that element of what do you do when you need to get rid of these chemicals, ideally well before anything unfortunate happens. So Jeff, what sort of costs would you expect to encounter when you're disposing of an expired peroxide? Or a peroxide former, I'm sorry.
That's a great question. So there's usually, so the costs that come with that typically are going to be whether or not you stabilize and how you stabilize the material, whether or not it's of the appropriate age or appearance that it might need a remote opening, right? So the idea is here's a container. It's full of potentially reactive peroxides in a highly flammable liquid. We want you to open it up and stabilize it, right? So the first question is that the right thing to do? Am I the right person to open this? How are we going to open it? And so if you actually get to the realization that you can't find anybody that's willing to open this, right, for good reason, then you're going to need a remote opening tool, a remote opening robot or some remote opening device. That's where a lot of cost now comes in, right? So your hazardous waste vendor typically has these. We have done them over my time. In fact, joining us today is my colleague Paul Miner. We recently did one on a material, and again, using our resources, recognizing that this was not something that an individual should open. We brought in the remote opening tool. The vendor opens it, and then we stabilize it. So, that is where a lot of the cost comes in then, right? Because they're going to come in, they're going to mobilize for kind of a remote opening, and there's a fee associated with that, usually a pretty steep fee. So some of the things you can do is, as best you can, especially if you have lab cleanouts where you're identifying a multitude of potential remote opening containers to try and, get the biggest bang for your buck, pardon the pun. But as many as we can do in a day. And I agree, Melissa's comment, it gets really expensive the more containers you have and the older they are. And then of course, once you get them open, what are we going to do? In most cases, you're not allowed to do much because that's treatment by rule. And so not too many of us have a treatment permit. And so we are allowed, and it varies by state, but we're allowed to do elemental neutralization, and we're allowed to do, at least in Pennsylvania, some of the stabilization. So then you have to find the material that's going to stabilize your peroxide former, which might be more of the original material, but it might be water, and it could be something as complex as some other solvent. And so there's a little bit of cost in that. And then occasionally, if we do have, let's say not peroxide formers, but let's say we have peroxides that are going for disposal. And in a lot of times, as the percentages rise and the materials become really strong peroxides, you might have to do a cold run shipment on these wastes for disposal. So the costs can accumulate quickly, especially if you're getting that remote opening service from whomever you get it from. The waste vendors do it. I know a lot of cities have bomb squads that will come in and do it as well. So it really depends on that aspect.
Cory, would you like to add anything to this one?
Yeah, I do think it's important to note that a lot of municipalities do have some pretty specific procedures. They may require a permit. They may require the fire department to be on site. Often these are going to happen on Saturday mornings when there's no one else in the building. So there's a lot more that goes into the coordination than, hey, we found this bottle. Can you come pick it up tomorrow? So, there's a lot that goes into it. You typically need to work. I think the most common is typically the hazardous waste contractor that you're working with. They have specialty teams. But yeah, if you think that this is going to be a quick process and an inexpensive process, yeah, it's typically not going to be simple. So, I like to involve senior managers as early as possible, especially depending on, the scenario or the type of institution you're at, because those budgetary items are going to be sticker shocks for a lot of people if they're not properly kind of made aware beforehand.
Yeah, and in addition to those upfront costs, there are always hidden costs with these things. Loss of productivity, your own time, which is very valuable, being used to try and coordinate these things, and also probably an element of just happiness and job happiness. Having an explosive suddenly be found in your workspace and having to experience, having somebody come in, take that out, whether you need a robot or a remote controlled, option. Those things can weigh on you in a way that it's hard to quantify, but definitely can reduce the ability for people to work happily in a space. So those things are all, important considerations if you're trying to justify something like, how do we get an adequate training program? How do we, get the resources that we need to actually handle these things? If you're feeling overwhelmed managing these, you should have the resources you need to take care of that. Now, hopefully, we don't get to the point where, you actually need to dispose of a peroxide, quite like this. So Tammy, I was wondering if you could tell us what steps you take to assess a container that has the potential for detonation.
I'm sure Cory handles them from time to time in his business, but the first thing that I do is I look at the bottle. I have a visual inspection. I don't move it. I try to assess its age if it's got a really old label on it. And if it, how is the lid looking? Is the lid look dented or has it popped off? And that has actually happened to me. One, I don't move it. I just take a look at it first. Do I see, can I see into the bottle and see any crystals form? Is there a lot of crystals on the lid? Is there an oily layer? That can happen. That usually really scares me, quite honestly, when I've seen that. So start off with a visual inspection. Don't be moving it around. And then I look at where it's stored as well when I'm doing the visual inspection. Is it, we talked about, is it near a window? Well, obviously there's going to be probably peroxides formed. It's near a window. Is it near, did somebody put it in a cabinet near an oven? So it's heated. These are kind of things that I used for, initial assessment. And then I decide, look, if I see something that's not physically good and I suspect, have a good indication there's crystals in it, et cetera, it's not been stored well, it's older, I'm gonna then work with my haz waste management people or my EH&S department to assess it. And most of the time, I'm not going to move that bottle until it gets stabilized. Also on the label, OSHA does require, and FPA and a couple other things, a couple other citations, that they have a label on them. So does it have a peroxide former label on it? Was somebody actually testing it, right? Because that gives me an indication of how it could be handled as well. So that's what I do. And if it passes my visual inspection and I'm not worried about it blowing up on me, obviously I have my lab coat, gloves, and goggles, and I'll move the container gently to the hood. Now, keep in mind, you don't want to bang it against something because they're very shock sensitive and we don't want them exploding. And then if I feel comfortable, you know, that everything looks visually well, I'll open it up and do some type of peroxide former test. Usually my go-to is something similar to, I don't know if you can see this because of the way it's done, a Quantifix. I mean, you can use a starch indicator, starch iodine indicator. There's a lot of things, but this is really easy to use, especially for the water soluble compounds. Water non-immiscible compounds, it gets a little bit trickier. But that's where I start off. And then, you know, again, if it's that 100 ppm, I'm going to waste it. If it's higher than that, we're going to gently close it, close the hood, say nobody go near it, and call our waste handler.
And we also use they're called explosins. It's a great name, but very, very similar, right? And I think ours go up to 500 ppm. I forget which SHEMA conference it was, but somebody, I want to say it was St. Louis or Disneyland, had a great study on at what parts per million do some of these peroxides actually begin to be energetic, right? And I think a lot of it was nothing under 1,000 ppm really looked to be all that energetic, but it, as Tammy indicated, exponentially gets worse as you go up, right? And you get in trouble real quick because they form quickly.
Yeah, one thing I'll add while we're talking about concentration is it's important to know what thresholds your hazardous waste contractor is comfortable with. So every hazardous waste contractor that I've dealt with has a slightly different view on which levels they'll put on the truck, you know, unstabilized versus stabilized versus remote open. So knowing, you know, what thresholds your hazardous waste contractors will take and adjusting your policy to make sure you have the appropriate buffers for those limits is a really good idea, just as you're developing policies.
Thanks, all of the panelists. So as I'm sure the panelists and others have noticed, I'm not Matt, I'm Jonathan. And Matt's internet just went down, as I think you could probably intuit. And I'm the backup. I work also at BioRAFT. Many of you know me, and I'm sure many of you don't. And so we're just gonna continue. Matt's trying to regain here. This is why we have backup, so things can continue. And so we still do have some more time before we usually transition to the Q&A. And I wish I had been following exactly what questions have been asked a lot closer, of course, but it's been a wonderful conversation. And so I'm going to kind of wing it. And if I ask a question that has already been asked, please be honest and let me know, and we'll move on to something else. But I think this conversation has been going great, and we are going to transition to the Q&A probably after one more or two more questions. So I'm going to ask to everyone, of course, because I think the value is in everyone. And so it sounds like you were just doing a lot of what's the concentration, how do we assess it? There was some good show and tell, a little different than I remember show and tell being in kindergarten though, although that would be interesting. So yeah, I think, you know, are there, and again, if this has been asked, please tell me, what have been any of the unexpected things besides what you've already talked about that you've run into that you can share as words of wisdom for the group at large?
If I could, and I'll just do a quick share screen picture, right? So This is a remote opening device, right? This is a tool that works off of pneumatics, and you have the ability to open a screw cap lid. There are adjustments that you can put on here. Let's say the lid is stuck. So Jonathan, to your point, like, what could go wrong? You're doing one of the most safe things you can do with a potential peroxide containing material with a remote opening, but the lid won't come off, right? So now you're spending all of this money on a hazmat bomb squad crew, and you're not going to be able to get it open to stabilize. So, do you have the ability to drill into this container? And do you have the risk appetite to drill into this container from where you're located with the material? And of course, these would all be examples of really old ethers that we wanted to test and or stabilize or dilute. And then, do you know your chemicals? These are ether container types that haven't been used since the 60s. So then, you really have something of potential there. So I think, a lot of the, what do we do now has to do with, how well do you know the material? And if you don't, you better seek out those people probably right in this whole presentation that can help you through that process. Know who your experts are in the areas.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Jeff. And of course, Tammy and Cory, please jump in. It looks like Cory's off of mute, and it looks like my good friend and partner Matt is back. So I'm going to fade back into the background here and turn it back over to Matt and to our great panelists. But thank you, everyone.
Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. My internet dropped, and then my computer actually decided that it didn't want to start Zoom again. So I am up on my secondary computer, still trying to get my heart rate slowed a little bit. And, I think all the fun things that happen to us more often is we are relying on our computers more for our standard communication things. So my apologies for the interruption. We are back on track. And, one of the unfortunate things here is the Q&A tends to get a little bit messed up whenever I drop here. So I'm going to do my best to sort of follow up here, get some information from other people who are still on as we're going, and let the conversation keep going here and get our presentation up as well. So if you'll give me one moment, feel free to continue, chatting about what was being discussed before I joined here.
And just like what Jeffrey just showed you and Cory hit on, I think this is where education comes in also for the PIs. What's the cost? We've just heard a lot. I mean, I think at the very low end, it starts $4,000 to $8,000 and on up. So I wanted to point out that information. That should be part of the education, because you're creating a lot of expenditure that's going toward stabilizing agents that just needed to be watched and taken care of initially to begin with.
All right, so I am going to make a quick here. Sorry, I'm going to be checking my phone a little bit because normally I have a secondary computer here that I rely on. And we are going to be getting the Q&A back up and into my hands here, as that tends to, again, disappear when when this all happens. But we will be transitioning over to our Q&A here, unless there are any other comments that you three would like to make or add in before we move on to our pretty extensive Q&A.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on the backup since it's a theme right now.
Sure.
Have somebody beyond just the primary person overseeing the program understand where all the peroxide formulas are. So there's not just one person managing the program. I would say more than one, but less than several, because if you have too many people managing them and they all have their own inventory, then you can miss them that way. But yeah, definitely not just one person overseeing the program.
All right. So before we move on, quick call out for our upcoming webinars. So I'm going to launch a poll while I get these things going, because these are the BioRAFT EHS community connection webinars. So we rely really heavily on you, our community, to help keep them going, to let us know what topics you're interested in, whether you or somebody who you know might be a good panelist. A huge thank you to our three panelists today for helping to create the space where we can share so much information and get all of this together and getting some cross-pollinating going. And also let us know whether we're on track. We are have been doing these for some time now, and I want to make sure we're hitting the right mix of informational things that are a little more granular, like our peroxide forming webinar, or things that are a little broader, things about project management, strategy, soft skills. So I'll leave that up while everybody gets back to me. Really appreciate knowing what you're interested in and how we're doing here and whether you know anybody as well. And then we have some upcoming webinars. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about full scientific reopening operations, seeing, what's coming on the horizon as our sites are going to be fully repopulated. Then we're going to have a fun one talking about scientific health and safety career growth possibilities, and our newest one talking about conflict resolution techniques. And as we're answering our Q&A, we will still have our Menti poll up. Sorry, it's still a little frazzled here. And you can let us know how many years of experience you have managing safety. I think last time we had across about 54 people, 900 years total of safety experience. And that's really what we're getting into the Q&A here. So as we are talking about the questions that are coming up, we are just not going to have enough time to answer everything that all of you have to ask. We wish we could, but this is an opportunity for you, our audience, to jump into the Q&A in the Zoom webinar control panel and let us know, what are your questions? What are your answers? If you see something you know an answer to, feel free to jump in and let us know. And I think that will help to, again, increase that spread of information present. And getting into our first question here from Don, this is getting back to Tammy, what you spoke about earlier, and I think what has come up in a lot of different questions. Has anyone ever found the foundational research that founds the basis of the standard class A, B, and C peroxide formers lists? I found nothing, I found the 1970s Journal of Chemical Education article, but nothing farther back.
This is just anecdotal, but I think it has to do with the stability of the intermediates with the peroxide formation. So it's somewhat chemical specific. So it may be an anecdotal list on the likelihood for there to be a catalytic reaction or how fast that intermediate becomes reacts. That's what it's looked like, but somebody may have a better answer.
And this is also one of those moments that I love in these webinars, which is, again, our panelists are not the supreme knowers of all things peroxide former. If anybody in our audience has some experience with this and, has a reference, feel free to drop it into that question and let Dawn know. It's a great way to, again, not just have it be about us, preaching down to you from the choir, from the pulpit. Coming up next, Patricia would like to know, Tammy, could you share your peroxide forming handling SOP?
Actually, I don't need to share it. You can just go to enhs.uark.edu, and under there we'll have SOPs, and it's right there. You can just go ahead and look at it. I'm sure that other universities also have SOPs as well. But an SOP is not a bad place to start.
Would you mind putting that link into the chat for our attendees?
I will do that.
Great, thank you. All right, next question here is from Jackie. Jackie asks, when should you call the bomb squad? What do people do when you find a 20-year-old bottle in the back of a cupboard?
So the first thing is obviously not to panic, right? But you do want to take those precautions where if you think you have something that is both old and reactive and has potential, then you need to close the lab down. And that's usually the hardest thing to do because now you're closing down a research lab that does not want to be closed down. But for all practical purposes, if you don't have somebody that is willing or has the expertise, experience in handling these things to a waste vault or somewhere safer, then you absolutely, and if you don't have a waste vendor, then you absolutely want to lean on the local support that you have, which is going to be the fire department and the bomb squad. And even though that probably doesn't get you the press that you want, it is absolutely the right thing to do if you have something you don't know what you're handling here. So the answer is when you don't know, I guess, and you don't have any other resources, or when you don't have nowhere else to go, then you definitely take that safe route and get people in there that will, at very least, get it out of where it is and into a safer place so you can reopen that lab and then you can manage it from wherever you get it to.
All right, great. Moving on to our next question. Carla says, I find a lot of PFs during lab cleanouts, or when I ask if someone is using these, they usually tell me no. I don't think that they really know what they are and what they can do. I also find that some folks will hide these chemicals even if they're expired, some by many years. How do we emphasize to get rid of these, especially when they are expired? Does anybody run into this issue of people who actually actively don't want you to take away their, precious old chemicals?
If they're not being used, they go.
Amen. Look, the reality is that most students aren't going, or people in the laboratory doing research aren't going to be using the compound on the shelf that's 3, even 5 years old. Okay, they're not going to be using them. They'll just order some more. So these are probably accumulating in the back of the cabinet. And if we can remove them and they're stable, we definitely do.
And we typically like to get rid of things that aren't being used, but if it is a material that has a long shelf life, it doesn't pose any dangers, unique to us would be acutely toxic, flammable solids, peroxides, then it can stay on the shelf. If people really, have a small need for a large container that they use sparingly over the years, then, don't fight don't fight the battle that you don't need to. But when you get to that point where you have people, and I've not had this in all of my time, literally hiding materials from you, I think you have a whole different safety problem than the old materials themselves.
And you can go into that space and test, do the test in front of them, bring it in, leave them. I like to leave them a baggie of test strips and how to use it and labeling information in that space. Yeah, test it in front of them if they don't believe you, or if you feel it's safe enough to do so.
I do know that it's very difficult in some institutions where the ordering and procurement and research operations is disjointed from the disposal. And if the costs are not going to be their costs, then they're going to hold on to them a lot longer. So finding ways to make the cost savings argument through channels that may not be that direct researcher can be more effective.
Also, when you talk about old chemicals, just a heads up, what happens when you use up most of the peroxide former in that bottle is you can get rapid evaporation and crystal formation. So be careful when you're looking at these hidden old compounds. Most of it may be gone. That doesn't mean the danger is gone.
Yes, 100 mils remaining from a 1 liter bottle is a lot different than 100 mils in a 100 ml bottle. They're not going to act the same. So there's a lot more air in the 1 liter bottle. There's just a lot of conditions that are they shouldn't be viewed as equivalent. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
And you can tie in, it's maybe not a policy, but you can tie into your waste minimization practices. So you have to show that you are actively trying to minimize waste according to EPA RCRA. And we actually put this in there on bulk purchases are generally frowned upon, and purchasing materials that you already have without getting rid of the old ones is not a green practice, right? So we work that into our waste minimization strategy as well, so that people have a little more buy-in as to why we're asking them to get rid of old chemicals that they do not need.
All right, and before we move on to our next one, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of our attendees for going into that Q&A tab and answering so many questions. I'm seeing some really great conversations going there, and it's nice. There are 37 open questions right now that I'm able to see at least, and I really love to know that not all of those are, as many of those are going to get answered as possible. So a big thank you to everybody who's jumped in and done that. The next question that I spotted here is from Sarah, and I thought this was a nice little change of pace here. Could the panel speak about the different training programs around peroxide formers that they have and how training competence is assessed? So, I know we've spoken a lot about education being the foundation for any good program, but are there any particular training metrics or milestones that you're looking for competence?
I have a module that I put on our Blackboard that allows people to go through self-paced Also, I tend to go into our department about every 2 years and take out a 15-20 minute section of a seminar and address things such as peroxide formers and hand out kits. It tends to work really well and gets the people engaged, especially if you give them something to take back to their lab. So how do we assess competence? You just have to go back in and look. But I would say that competence is a really difficult thing to assess in a research environment, because I have some users of THF who take really good care of it, and it goes way past the expiration date without any peroxide formation. Then I have one group that it barely lasts 20 days in their hands. So I think you have to look at each group individually and user.
The other thing too is I include a peroxide former awareness portion of training, even for groups that aren't actively using peroxide formers, because it doesn't take very long if they are in between training cycles for them to procure material. If you don't have a great gatekeeping system like Jeff was mentioning, but yeah, so there's always the awareness piece in addition to the active handling piece.
We tend to, if we're not specifically in a training and awareness for peroxide formers, we back it up in the waste section of our training. So we have a lab safety, which is part 1, and we have a hazardous waste management, which is part 2. And that's where we cover in a little more detail these potentially reactive materials, not just peroxide formers, but sodium azide and piranha solution and aqua regia. So this is where we cover a lot of the dangers and the precautions and why we're doing these reviews of peroxides, so that they, they realize that the link is this chemical and waste. It's got, they go together, kind of like the tongue and groove. It's they go together because peroxides and peroxide formers have expiration dates for a reason.
Yeah, we're also talking a lot about storage here, but if you do have groups that are doing the higher risk operations like distillations or like rotovaps, those are not just a classroom training type scenario. Those are hands-on training, understand the procedure, formal SOP, so that everybody knows the process of testing that material before it goes onto those systems.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, Matt, there was another question in there about what about anyone who's using these distillation chambers, right? So there are some wonderful products out there for polishing, purifying without the need for sodium and other hazardous materials. What I would say to the answer is that is we do not have ether in THF columns. And the reason is, these distillations and purification systems are for solvents that you use a lot in volume. And so you in order to get THF or ether in one of those polishing units, you really have to show us that you're using a lot. And if that's the case, then you should be going through it, and you shouldn't have this issue of peroxide buildup, even if it's in a purification system.
Yeah, I've seen groups put a policy in place where those have to be used and the volume has to be turned over at least weekly or monthly in order to justify their use.
I would agree. Monthly is is getting close.
Monthly's cutting it close. Yeah,
Yeah.
that has to. Yeah, I agree.
But I do agree that's a great policy to have some time limit on how often you have to turn it over.
Right, moving on to our next question here from Evelyn asking, does anyone use indicating molecular sieves or commercial products like Expel by Explosive to prevent peroxide formation in storage? Has this worked well? I'm an EHS and we're considering providing them to chemical owners to prevent more costly disposal.
Ordering is cheaper.
Order it with a SEPTA on it. That's my advice. And then it makes it a lot easier. We have had a limited use of molecular sieves in some labs with limited success. Again, it just depends on the user and how careful they're being. So molecular sieve is not going to take care of all the moisture that somebody introduces.
Yeah, I think it would be a very, very specific operation to where that would become cost effective versus just better inventory management and ordering.
Yeah, think that that gets into the hierarchy of controls as well. Of, you know, if you're looking at something like that, it might be better to take a few steps back and say, you know, can we really apply more effort at an educational and tracking level that'll prevent us from needing to have these situations that could fail a little more readily. Great. And looking down here, of course, if any of you see a question that you'd particularly like to answer, just feel free to let me know. Jason asks, at what ppm threshold do you recommend peroxide formers be removed from labs and sent out as waste? Is that a number that you all have at the top of your head, something that depends based on the chemical in question?
Generally, when you have, because these compounds violently decompose and it's through an autocatalytic mechanism, generally you're not going to get less peroxides forms over time, you're going to get more. And so I've seen a variation with different universities on what their set point is. Generally, you don't want anything over 100 ppm in your lab, especially for any kind of distillation, but our policy within our department is anything over 20, 30 ppm we get rid of, because the situation is just going to get worse. And we don't know whether it'll get worse tomorrow or next month. There's no way to predict it.
My default policy is 10% of whatever the hazardous waste contractor is going to be willing to put on the truck. So I do know that some groups cap it at 50, some groups cap it at 70, some groups are comfortable going up to 120. 10% of that is generally going to be in the 5 to 10 range. That tends to be where I try to get the number. Doesn't always work, but that's where I try to get it.
There's another comment on a different question of related topic where Jason comments, the only problem with the 100 part per million, which he uses too, is that it's the same threshold some manufacturers use for their QC analysis. So you often get new chemicals that already may be close to that. So I think that, Cory, that speaks a little bit to your point as well of going a lot lower than you might need to, and also having that be relative to disposal and sort of the more real world application of, can I get this off easily and cheaply, or am I going to need to suddenly ratchet up to another threshold of cost and challenge for this?
Yeah, just to clarify a little bit more, part of the reason I also go with a little bit more of a conservative 10% of what they're willing to put on the truck is the test strips are not all that accurate. There's definitely a range there depending on which test strips you're using. They jump up generally by factors of 10. So I use a factor of 10 when creating the buffer.
Great. Well, it is somehow 4 p.m. Eastern time already. This is our scheduled webinar end date, and we still have so many more questions to ask here. So we always do see if our panelists are able to stay on for an extra 15 or so minutes to address some of these. Of course, if you do need to go, we completely understand. The recording of this webinar will be posted later. I think we're going to be able to get this Q&A up for download as well, anonymized and everything, just to make sure that information is shared. But if anybody does need to go, a huge thank you to our panelists for creating the space and answering all these questions. This has just been a fantastic discussion, and I appreciate everybody's comfort and acceptance as I work through my own technical difficulties on today's webinar. Okay, so do you know if you'll all be able to stay on for a little longer and get to some more of these questions?
I can stick around.
Great, fantastic. Getting on to a next question here that I see from Becky asking, do you have any recommendations on a testing schedule for peroxide formers? And she also asked about the ppm amount for disposal, which we've discussed.
Well, I think we start off with maybe the ones that kind of are in the class B. I mean, they're in the class B because if you concentrate them down, let's say in the rotovap, during some type of chemical process, you can increase the amount of peroxides that you're dealing with and have an explosion. If you look at lessons learned, I think Berkeley site, they actually had somebody who had a vessel, glass explode because of that. So I think anytime you're doing concentration, you definitely, or distillation, you definitely want to check, period. But I think there's general guidelines on class A, B, C's, and D's on how often you keep them. I know the class A's, if they don't have an inhibitor, you're supposed to get rid of them after one use. I think the max you can keep them is 3 months. Class C's is usually around 6 months to a year. Class B's can be a year to a year and a half, and that's only if they're peroxide free. And Class D's, well, it tends to vary immensely. I find that I typically do not have much problems with Class D's. Maybe one of our other speakers has had issues with them.
All right. Great. Well, we can leave. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, we don't set a schedule necessarily on those materials. We look more for either in ChemTracker when they were first entered in or on the bottle when they're labeled, and we try to catch it at the inspection. So we really are looking more at date than at concentration where we are. But we will test as needed, obviously.
Yeah, one of the more common questions I get is, well, we're at 12 months, but we're at 0 ppm. Can we keep it? And that's when I typically put it on the scientist to come up with a schedule for testing to ensure that it's at 0 ppm and it remains at 0 ppm. And generally that's either going to be quarterly or monthly, depending on the material and, you know, how it looks. Again, to Jeffrey's point, I like monthly rather, you know, the shorter the process, the better. They also have to come up with a timeline for absolute disposal. So if they haven't used it in 3 months, it's gone. If they haven't used it in 6 months, it's gone, regardless of if it's still coming up at 0 ppm.
No. A quick question just to follow up. If you do have that situation where you have a peroxide former 12 months old and is at 0 ppm and you think, well, that's maybe a little unusual, do you normally go to another testing option just to verify that the one you're using is picking things up? Or are you generally pretty confident that, okay, well, no, the conditions have just been good for this one?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much variability in how long they actually last that it's not uncommon to get to 12 months and test strip it and have it be 0. I don't think that's an uncommon scenario for most of certainly the Class Bs. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't expect it necessarily and plan on that, but it comes up enough to at least have a plan in place for how to handle that material.
Yeah, and we might get an issue where somebody had bought a peroxide former and hasn't opened it in a year for some reason. And that's going to happen, especially with coronavirus, right? It may have been sitting there for a year and they're asking me what to do. And physically, if it looks good, we're going to test it and then put a plan in place for further testing, because, you know, it can go bad. But also look at that bottle, look at that cap, you know, is the cap in good condition? Even if it's not been opened, is there air leaking into it? Those type of questions I do ask, but, you know, we can't just throw everything because it's got an expiration date on it, because it might go bad way before or be good for a little while after.
Yeah,
A good practice to get into is to know the price of your chemicals, right? So, and I don't know where everybody is, but a gallon of THF around here is no more than $60. So when you point out, you know, to a researcher who maybe thinks I spend thousands of dollars on chemicals and I'm not getting rid of this thing just because the date's getting close, when you remind them that, well, you really only spent $50 on it, do you really want to go and start testing this monthly to appease the safety requirements? You could talk them out of materials a little easier.
Yeah, and that's why I have the scientists do the testing. They hold on to it a lot longer if someone else is doing the testing for them.
That's a great point.
Yeah, hand out kits. It works.
Next question here from Jennifer saying, we have a tracking system with aging status by container. Not so interested in the tracking as in how to identify the real concerns versus the super conservative list that she's seen around. So I don't know if you've all had to navigate this feeling like, okay, we're worried there's a peroxide former. Here's every single potential one. And then it's hard to sift through and find the things that you really need to be spending your time and energy on.
A-list chemicals, first priority, always, because those can go bad, like I said, without an inhibitor the first time you open it. Next thing I look at is I look at those vinyl monomers, you know, in Class C. And then I usually worry about Class Bs. But unfortunately, I think most of the dangerous chemicals that you get, dangerous peroxide formers that you see, are probably older in the class Bs.
All right, great. Just looking through for another answer here. Yeah, it looks like there are a lot of questions just about parts per million here, how long they go before they expire. Similar questions about just aging and wondering, okay, do I really have something that's going to turn bad and dangerous under my nose without my knowing, or is this something where I can keep track of that? And it seems like a lot of the answers that we have are converging on this element of having a way of flagging them when they come in, knowing at the outset when they come in and when they're going to reach that, 3, 6, 12-month milestone, and being able to identify that will be a big weight off everybody's shoulders.
And I think there was a question in there about if anybody stores their peroxide formers in a glove box to try and
yes.
take away that element of expediting the formation. And I would say no here. We do not typically store, because glove box space is such a premium that they're really utilizing that for whatever chemistry they're doing, and not for storage of spaces. Although I guess that would do the trick very well.
Yeah, I would recommend not using your glove box as a storage space, because you're generally working with higher hazard materials within that glove box. And now you've got some flammables that you've put in, because all peroxide formers are flammables, but not all flammables are peroxide formers. So you've introduced other chemicals into that environment. And if it goes wrong, it's going to go wrong big. But we do tend to buy, people who use very small amounts infrequently, we tend to buy them with septas already in them. So it makes it easier to remove the solvent without exposure to air.
Yeah, and I have had groups designate one location for peroxide former storage so that it makes the monthly visual checks a lot easier. You can go into one cabinet and do them all at once. Other groups, have it per scientist. It really depends. As long as they're being tracked, though, one of the things that's worked really well for some of my groups is just to put a brightly colored sticker on all the peroxide formers as an added inventory management tool. That way you can more quickly identify ones that may have slipped into the back of the cabinet or, are where they shouldn't be. So, there are ways to kind of supplement your standard inventory practices to make it a little bit easier to track them within the lab.
I would say the stickers is a great idea. I do that myself. It's bright red and white. You see it in the cabinet right away.
Yeah.
It's a great way to.
If ours is a starburst and it has a date on it, that is a great practice.
Yeah, the visual aids can really help a lot and are easy to underestimate. I think we spoke a little bit earlier about the P ordering cards, and putting the skull and crossbones on those might end up being a helpful reminder to the people. Well, looking at another question here, a few times there have been a question from our audience about isopropyl alcohol and secondary alcohols. So a lot of tables of peroxide formers include secondary alcohols. This one is from David. Do any of you have experience with peroxides forming in isopropanol or other similar chemicals?
I have only heard of one story, and it was somebody who was going into a high school lab to get rid of their chemicals, and there was literally a 50-year-old bottle of isopropanol that had crystals formed in it. It was not me, but that's the only time I've heard of isopropanol, and I definitely don't have problems with isopropanol specifically.
Yeah, neither do we. No.
Yeah, the only similar thing, I know MTBE is occasionally not categorized as a peroxide former. I have test stripped peroxide positive MTBE. It did have a damaged cap, so that certainly contributed. But yeah, so class Ds, from what I've seen in most standard contexts, again, going back to all conventions are somewhat different, but there is a list of things that are similar looking, for lack of a better term, to peroxide formers that aren't categorized as in the same A, B, or C class. But you should still, even if you hear that those aren't definitively peroxide formers, it's still worth testing if you have, bottles that get to an advanced age.
And one final question here from Lori asking, can the panelists share any incidents that didn't turn out well and lessons learned? We are a little short on time, so maybe if there's a brief little tidbit or just sort of a nugget of information that might help somebody.
I think there's 134 participants, and we all have a story or two that we could share. I guess I would summarize mine in saying that in my 20 years, I've opened up a couple hundred bottles of peroxide formers with no explosions, so very anticlimactic. But I will say that picric acid does blow up that one. We had a bomb squad blow up Tammy right there, and it most certainly blows up.
Yeah, most of the incidents that I've seen are not storage related. They're rotovap or distillation related. It's the active process of concentrating. That's why I think it's important when you're talking to scientists to, give them the benefit of the doubt that something's not just going to spontaneously blow up, or if a cabinet gets, nudged, it's gonna blow up. But the potential is there. So, I always say, very low likelihood, very high consequence. So, it's one of those things where you're putting it on the spectrum. But yeah, in terms of just opening a bottle and having it blow up, it hasn't happened to me. Have there been bottles that I have not opened? Yes. I've referred those to the peroxide forming experts at the Has Waste team. They tend to be a lot more cavalier about what they're willing to, play around with, though. So they will reach into the cabinet and open it. But yeah, they know a lot more about that topic than I do.
One thing I would caution, and this is something that we're seeing here, is, do you know who in your groups or in your chemistry or wherever are using reaction chambers, right? So these reaction high pressure, high temperature vessels that are PAR vessels, what kind of chemistry are they doing in there? And if they're messing with peroxides, then you really have something you need to keep an eye on.
That's a great point. That's the first question I always have when I'm looking through a lab and see a reaction chamber. Okay, is there a peroxide former in this lab? Now I'm asking questions.
Or are you planning on forming one in the course of a reaction? I think, Tammy, when we were talking a while back, you mentioned running into a situation where during a risk assessment, somebody realized they were going to be putting a peroxide former in a ball mill. Is that correct?
That is correct. So they were doing bench chemistry in the chemistry department, and they were collaborating with chemical engineering, and there was a proposed pilot scale up, a small scale up, and they were getting ready to put it in a ball mill, and they were reviewing it with me. And I said, that's a peroxide former. And they looked at me, and the student knew what that was because of our training, and just went blanch white. Because yes, it was going to go into a ball mill, and that would have been terrible. Fortunately, other chemical avenues were actually more productive, and we didn't have to use the peroxide former. So
I think that's a great point that's come up here, is not just having this be something that rests solely on your ability to track an individual container, its entry date, its expiration date, but also looking out for things like reaction vessels, ball mills, or other places where there might be impact or shocks or vibrations, and also scale ups, having all those things to suddenly trigger that, hey, have you done a risk assessment? Are you familiar with peroxide formers? Can really help to catch these situations ahead of time where you get to avoid any other costly mistakes or issues. I'm going to take one last look here at our word cloud, looking at all the years of safety. I'm excited to kind of put this all together and hear about and see where everybody's experience lies. And a huge thank you to all of our panelists for coming in here. I know that there are still a lot of open questions here, but man, it's great to see so many people coming in and volunteering their information. I'm glad to have everybody on. Hope you all have a great time. Looks like Jeff had to jump, but a big thank you for creating this space for us and for volunteering your time and effort. I hope everybody has a great weekend, and thanks for joining us.